which focused on the cause of the global problems of the world industry. The topic is very similar to what we will be discussing today. And with great pleasure, I would like to present to you Graeme Maxton, General Secretary of the Club of Rome, an international organization which was created in Rome in 1968, and it had to focus on making the global problems popular. So this organization is called the consciousness of the world, and people try to the conscience of the world. It focuses on protecting the environment and solving a number of social challenges that the humanity faces. And the name itself, looking for well-being, or this will focus on many different issues today, and we will discuss the major global and dominant problems. So there is a book, and the book focuses on finding radical solutions to the problem which humanity faces. It is not about economic growth, but it focuses on ecological problems. And this is the phenomenon of this work. And we see at the center of attention the human being and the quality of life as the measure of the success of its life. So should we increase the speed of economic growth, which the global community interprets as the most important thing? But the most important thing is that continuous growth is the purpose of growth of cancer cells, and if we follow this step, we will achieve the same result, death. So the problem of inequality and poverty, using natural resources and increasing pollution is something people do not mention enough. And sometimes these topics are a manipulative instrument in political games. So today, Mr. Maxton, with great pleasure and with great respect, I would like to give you the floor to present you, so that you could present your presentation. And I'm sure that you will make us closer to understanding the global reasons for the problems we're facing today, and how we will be able to build the future which will allow for everyone to express themselves and make the society perfect, make the society so that it will be able to change the measures of success. Thank you. I give you the floor.
Thank you, Natalia. I'm sorry, I must speak in English. Let's start with Limits to Growth. Limits to Growth was published in 1972, and it presented a number of long-term scenarios for the future. For those of you that were upstairs before, it looked at 200 years of human history. The book's not about economic growth. The book is about what we call the ecological footprint. And we said that if we carry on increasing the number of people, and we carry on increasing the rate of economic production, use of resources, generation of pollution, use of food, then by around 2030, the system would enter a crisis, a collapse. And what's happened is that nobody listened to us. Nobody listened to us in 1972. And so where we are today is that we live as if we have 1.5 planets. We live beyond the capacity of the planet. And so it's not possible now to avoid that collapse globally. All we can do is manage the process. We live in overshoot. And so the Club of Rome's approach has changed. Before we were trying to warn about a collapse, and now we are trying to help people understand so that they can understand the consequences and manage the collapse and reduce the impact. The consequences of us living beyond the capacity of the planet are most obviously through climate change. Climate change is really a much more serious problem than most people understand. I'll talk more about that in a minute, but climate change really is an urgent problem. But also the migration crisis, the gap between rich and poor has increased the number of people who are moving from Africa up to Europe and from Central Africa into South Africa and from places like Bangladesh into India and from Indonesia into Australia. All of this is driven by a system which is not in balance for humanity. The political crisis is caused by people not seeing that the big challenges are not being addressed. Poverty is increased because of an increase in population and an unequal distribution of work and wealth. And then there's the pollution of the oceans, the pollution of the skies, the pollution of food in many cases if you live in China, and then the growing inequality. So all of these problems have come from the same basic source, which is our economic system, having too many people and trying to do too much in too short a time. I mean, why do we have these problems? We have these problems because of the economic system, which drives us to increase output every year. Every year we talk about increasing GDP. And because we have to increase GDP, it means we need to use more resources, which requires us to use more energy. And because we use more energy, we create more CO2, which increases the rate of climate change. Why, given the seriousness of the problem, why haven't we not done anything about it? Why have we not responded to such a serious problem? Partly, I think it's understanding. Most people don't understand how urgent the problem is. If we don't stop pumping CO2 into the atmosphere, then in just 3 years, we will pass through the level which makes 1.5 degree temperature increase inevitable. That doesn't mean that we'll reach 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial times in 3 years, but we'll make it inevitable. It'll happen about 10 or 15 years later. But we can't stop that. And at 1.5 degrees, all the coral reef on the planet will die. At 2 degrees, we actually take the planet back 10 million years in terms of climatic history, to a time where most of the Antarctic ice shelf will disappear. If we go to 4 degrees, which is where we're headed today, then all the ice on the planet will disappear, and we'll take the planet back more than 45 million years in climatic history. Now, we will reach 2 degrees, or we will make 2 degrees inevitable in around 2035. And when we think about 2 degrees, we think, well, that's okay. 2 degrees is like the difference between the temperature today and yesterday in KIEF. But we need to think about 2 degrees more like we think about our bodies. Our bodies are finely tuned biological mechanisms that function at 37 degrees. When we go to 38, then it's a fever. When we go to 39, our life is actually in danger. And it's the same with the planet. It's a finely tuned biological mechanism. And danger is that if we go to 2 degrees, we begin a process which will become unstoppable. And that we'll go up to 4 or 5 or 6 degrees, which will kill off most of the life on this planet. That's how serious the situation is. We have to deal with this quickly, and that means we have to decarbonize our economies quickly. Why don't we do anything? Several main reasons. One, I think, vested interests. We see the 1% who has so much wealth, and they don't want to change. Timing. In 1972, when the Limits to Growth was published, it was too early for people to understand the need to take a different path. Today, I think people understand better, but they still don't understand enough. And so the situation has become more urgent before we change. A lack of understanding. The cost of doing things right is going to be more than the way we do things today. We're going to have to pay more for our energy. We're going to have to consume products that last longer, which means they're going to be more expensive. And also a natural inertia, that we don't like change. We like to have the system as we know it. We don't want something which is unknown. but also because we've been fed the wrong message for the last 35 years. We've been told that growth is good, that resource extraction is good, that we can have children as we like, and that that has no consequence. And so today we have a situation where there will be very serious consequences within 20, 30 years. And the generation that's alive today and the generation of the last 30 years has created that problem. So we have an older generation which has created a major problem which the future generation will have to deal with. What do we not need? We do not need technology. We heard a lot this morning about innovation and technology. We have all the technology we need to solve the problems we have. They simply cost a bit more. We have to pay a bit more for our energy. But we don't need any innovation. There's no magical Hollywood-style ending that's going to come with us inventing some solution to climate change and the social problems. And we do not need market-based solutions. We don't need something which is based on the free market, because the free market is the cause of these problems. Somebody asked me upstairs if I'm a communist. This is a dangerous thing to be. And I'm not a communist, but I'm not a capitalist either. The system that we have in the West, the capitalist system, does not function, just as the communist system did not function. Neither system are functioning properly. Both systems will lead us into a bad direction. We need something new and we need something different. We need something which reinvents the entire economic system. So, with that as the background, why did we do this book? And I did this book with Jürgen Randers, who was one of the original authors of Limits to Growth. We live in a short-termist society where we only think about the short term, and we live in a society where people don't understand the problems. But what they do understand is inequality, and they understand not having a job. And so we've focused on economic policies which will address those short-term problems, which will reduce inequality, which will create jobs, and which at the same time will reduce the pace of climate change. So they're policies which will benefit the democratic majority, which means that everybody should be open and welcome the ideas that we proposed, and which give them an immediate benefit, but which also begin to change the mentality so that we don't think that we need GDP growth, that we don't think we need to have job creation, we don't think technology is going to solve the problem, and that we realize that climate change is something which can be solved by a gradual transition. So that's what the book's about. The book is about how to move the world onto a more sustainable path without using conventional policies, by using unconventional policies which redistribute wealth and work and change the way we think about our economies and our societies. I know there are a lot of problems that we're likely to generate with some of our proposals. I know they're not simple. But Jürgen and I have thought about this long and hard, and we can see no other way to move forward, because the alternatives are either we carry on as we're doing today, in which case we'll have a crisis, or we have some sort of revolution, but by then it's probably too late. So we need to have a series of policies which shift us onto a better pathway, and that's what's in this book. Thank you.
Пане Макстоне, в своїй книзі ви справедливо зазначаєте, що
Mr. Maxton, in your book you state that most of the global issues will relate to human beings, the role and place of humans in manufacture, and also the role of the government in job creation and ensuring basic minimal incomes for population. This will be a huge pressure on the public finance system. Will there be some humanization of global economy, Mr. Maxton, or humanity will be some extra resource, excess resource, and maybe soon we will witness how some the programs of non-stimulation of births, but restriction of births. Thank you.
I mean, there's two questions. One, do people become redundant? And secondly, about restricting births. So the first question about do people become redundant? We have a choice. We have a choice as to how we let our economies develop. With digitization, with the mechanization and robotization of lots of our economies, we will create lots of unemployment. And if you listen to some people who write on this, they say, well, this is a great time to be an entrepreneur. But what do you know, a lot of people don't want to be an entrepreneur, they want to work for somebody else, and you'd have to have an awful lot of new ideas to soak up the number of millions, hundreds of millions of people who are going to lose their jobs. So unless we change our economic system with digitization, we're going to end up in a world which is more like the medieval time, where we have 1 or 2% of people who are very rich and 98% of people who are very poor. Which makes no sense because it takes away the entire market for all the products that we're trying to create. So we need to find some mechanism to redistribute the benefits of digitization. In the 1930s, John Maynard Keynes talked about an economy where you only need to work for 15 hours a week. And actually in Europe today, in Western Europe today, that should be possible. We have enough output, we have enough work, we have enough wealth for everybody to live comfortably without any GDP growth. But because it's so unevenly distributed, we have this unfairness, and so people have to work. So we need to change our thinking so that we redistribute, and not just within Europe, but also from the rich world to places like Ukraine and the poorer world, to give people more of a chance to live fulfilling lives, to redistribute wealth. So I think part of the answer is that we have to share the benefits of digitization more evenly, and we have to find a mechanism to do that, and that has to be through the taxation system, through government. And then secondly, when it comes to population, we need to manage the population of the planet better. We cannot continue increasing at 100 million people a year. I mean, it's just an insane number that will become, you know, consumers and energy users for generations to come, unless we do something about it. Now, there's not much we can do quickly, but we can educate women. We can increase availability of contraception. We can increase urbanization. And there are ways that we can reduce the population growth rate, and we can also give an incentive to women, particularly in the rich world, to have fewer children, because we think that the problem of population is one in China, or not so much in China these days, but India or Africa or Latin America. But actually the biggest problem is in the rich world. A child born in the rich world has an ecological impact that is 32 times greater than a child born in Africa. So it's the children in the rich world that are the problem, and we need to find a way to manage that too.
До речі, оскільки ви щойно згадали про Індію.
You've just recalled India. There is a question which I think experts from the international experts will have an opinion on. You see, several years ago, India, they promised the future of China for India several years ago, but it looks like robots will replace low-qualified jobs, low-qualified workers. Those people will not be needed. So the competitive advantage which India was hoping and relying on, like cheap workforce, will not be an advantage anymore for external investors. So what do you see now? We are now witnessing the review of the scenario of global movements or not?
Well, I think, first of all, I mean, India was never going to be another China. Everybody, you know, there are lots of people, economists talked about India being the next China, but it never was. Culturally, completely different, and different political system. Democracy is a huge disadvantage in places like India. Oh. But also, you know, being a low-cost manufacturer of products which are labor-intensive is still going to be an advantage to many countries. The biggest problem with a lot of the digitization is that it will take away middle management jobs. It'll take away the analysts in banks. It'll take away a lot of people who drive trucks or fly airplanes or drive trains. It'll take away people who are quite skilled. And you'll be left with a situation where you have very low-skilled jobs that require manual input, which will be relatively badly paid. And then you'll have very highly paid jobs which require lots of intellectual input, but nothing much in between. And that's the real challenge, because that's going to affect hundreds of millions of people in the rich world and make it also more difficult for countries like like India ever to develop. And so in the poor world, it requires reform of the agricultural system, for example, because one of the problems that's creating a lot of climate change is that we've mechanized a lot of the agricultural system. We're creating a system which takes people off the land, but also results in huge amounts of nitrate use, which then adds to the climate change problem. So we need to go backwards in terms of agriculture. And then in the rich world, we need to find a way to redistribute the benefits of digitization.
Дякую. Якщо можна, іще одне питання.
If you allow, I have another question. Many countries in the world face the barrier of productivity. This is what you refer to in your book. Robotization will not influence the average GDP level, but it will increase business incomes for businesses. So, as for me, there will certainly come a moment of the truth, whether economy should serve people or people will exist to ensure profits for the corporations. How do you think? Will there appear some social pressure, risks, and will this lead to some regulations and governmental restrictions and attacks on those who own capitals?
Clearly, you're right. I mean, the entire policy will drive money towards a small elite who will become very, very rich. And so the question then is, will there be a social backlash? And you can certainly see some of the political changes, the election of Donald Trump, Brexit, are a result of a political backlash. The emergence of far-right parties in Germany or France or even in Sweden are because of a political backlash, that people see that the political system is not functioning. It's also true, I think, that change takes place very slowly at this level. If you look at Russia before the revolution, or France before the revolution, the population is willing to put up with a huge amount of suffering for decades sometimes before they demand change. But then you see the emergence of something like Occupy or the umbrella movement in Hong Kong, the beginnings of people beginning to move onto the streets and say, this has to stop, we need change. And I think that's the only way forward. I don't think the way forward is through the political process, because a lot of the politicians are now in the hands of the big business, and so they're quite happy to maintain the existing system. It has to be through political pressure from the bottom up. It requires a mass movement of people. Not everybody. It maybe needs 15 or 20% of the intelligent people in the world to say we need change, but it requires a mass movement for us to have the change that's needed.
Дякую. Пане Макстоне.
Thank you very much. Mr. Maxton, in your book you've stated that given the aging of nation, which is now observed in many developed countries, economy loses the resource for renewing itself. At the same time, developed countries are places where migrants are actively going, so qualified workforce goes there and it somehow compensates the demographic window. It is understandable that an ability to create new ideas, technologies and lifestyle is what rich countries, this is a benefit for rich countries. They use the best resource, humanity, human resources. Do you think that under current conditions there are all ground to regulate workforce markets? For example, in Ukraine we can see that there are terrible consequences of the policy of openness. 1 million of people leaving for Poland every year, and the birth rate is decreasing, and potential parents of these people not staying here. So from the perspective of a young person, which young people see as a window of opportunities on the governmental level, it's actually the loss of the right for the future. We again face the choice whether we ensure private liberties or we maintain our national course and policy. How do you think? What will be the prospects for both developed countries which are interested in workforce, in qualified workforce, and what about our countries from where people are living?
Obviously a very difficult question. It's again a question, I think, of protectionism and social values and political decisions. If you don't nurture your population, I mean, one of the big advantages that Ukraine has got is that it has a very well-educated population, people who are well-educated in mathematics and science and engineering, which obviously is attractive to other countries. But it doesn't do enough domestically to support and maintain and encourage these people so that they stay here. And of course, freedom of movement, which is primarily for the benefit of big business rather than for societies.
Але ж асиметрія економічного розвитку – це ж факт доконаний.
But there is asymmetry in economic development, and how we can eliminate such factors as asymmetry. How should we deal with this? Because in Ukraine there are no proper conditions. Free markets attract people, and people want to have a better life, to be more wealthy. They attract, rich countries attract our workforce, and of course it's the issue of choice again, and probably it's the issue of responsibility.
So there are two ways to do it. One is to nurture what you've got, and that means paying people properly and finding ways to pay people properly to stay, so that they feel that they have a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning and a sense of direction, and that they're properly recognized for that. You say, well, how are you going to finance that? Well, one way you can finance that is printing money. You can print money to develop your economy. Now, that seems like a very strange idea because we've got into the idea that printing money is a bad thing to do. But Japan and Europe and the United States have printed trillions of dollars in the last 10 years to save the banking system and to boost their economic activity. So Ukraine printing some money to pay people properly, to nurture a young generation and encourage them to stay in the country is not so stupid because you invest in the long term. The other thing is to offer a good work-life balance. A lot of people leave here and they go to places where they have to work for 15 hours a day. They're exploited very badly where they are, and they may be getting some more money, but they often have very miserable lives. So the other thing to do is to make sure that the lifestyle here, that the well-being here, that the thinking of the society is such that people will want to stay. So I think it's a question of paying people properly, recognizing them properly, and then giving them a lifestyle, a quality of living that makes them want to stay.
Дякую. І якщо...
Thank you very much. And if the audience will allow me, I will ask the final question before I give the floor to people, to the audience. Mr. Maxton, you fairly state that such global issues may be solved if there is an opportunity to take care of some gaps in globalization, disrupts in globalization. You know, many people here favor free competition, and you know, we are still somebody still persuades us that we still have free equal opportunities with other countries on this, but nonetheless national economies are very dependent on multinational corporations and over national and international institutions, not to mention the effects of speculative capital. And speculative capital lives by its own rules. What do you think? Who should be responsible for the ideology changes? Who will be responsible for changing the ideology of cooperation between the countries? Should this be some international institution? If so, who will be in charge of such institution? Or maybe the global community will continue serialization, building series on this. You know, the branch until the branch on which the world elite sits will be broken.
I could use the word colonization and mean something very similar. It's a process of taking a neoliberal, primarily American-based system into developing countries and into countries with resources, telling them, open up your markets, open up your economies, and you'll get rich. But actually what happens is you open up your markets, you open up your economies, and they get rich. They take all your resources, they get all the benefits, and you get nothing. So this economic system is a seductive drug, which the poor world has been fed for the last 35 years, but actually it's only the rich world that has benefited. And only even there, a few corporations and a few individuals, which is why you have this huge gap between rich and poor. You lose your resources, you're unable to protect yourself, and so you end up in 20 years' time with nothing, a medieval society. So globalization is actually, it swung way too far in the wrong direction so that it's so unfair for the majority of the global population. How do you change that? Okay, the politicians are not the place to begin. I mean, I've had some conversations this morning, and there are a lot of educated politicians in Ukraine who understand what I'm saying. So maybe here it's different, but in most of the world, the politicians are not the place to begin because they don't understand and they're being paid by the big corporations. And so who's going to change the system? I think it's a very strange collection of individuals. We've been doing some work with the Vatican recently. Now, the Vatican Pope Francis came out last year with Laudato Si, a huge step forward in terms of educating 3 billion people in the world that the economic system is unfair, that we need to have a more socially balanced system that thinks about the economy. The trades union movement, the military, actually, the military in Germany and even in the United States understand how dangerous climate change is going to be, and they understand the need for change. The judicial system, help educate judges so that they understand what needs to change. The education system, and that's again why we've pushed towards educating young people, educating particularly people who study economics, to understand that their entire discipline is flawed, that it's taking us in a bad direction. So I think we need a coalition driven by young people and a strange group of organizations, the Chinese and the Germans, because they both understand the need for radical change better than most other countries. So it's a sort of strange group of people. And within that, there is a business case. There is a business, sustainable business ideas that can help. But sustainable business is only maybe 2% of the answer. So getting into CSR and trying to do sustainable business is not going to solve the world's problems. That's a small part of the answer. But we need a coalition of people who understand to work together. And I just to sort of finish on an optimistic note, I see that happening. Everywhere I go these days, there are more and more people who are waking up to the need for change and radical change. And they're coming from all sorts of different walks of life. But it's sadly not, in most parts of the world, coming from the political system.
Дякую. Я думаю, що сьогодні ми можемо розпочати з тих, хто присутні всі.
Thank you. I think that today we can begin from those people who are present in this room, transforming the planet in the way that Mr. Maxton said. So now I would like to give you, the audience, the floor, the opportunity to speak to Mr. Graeme and to ask him questions. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is the Institute of Modern Economy of Ukraine. I have the question about the availability of markets in the global environment. But before forming my question, I would like to mention Peruvian Hernando de Soto book about the capital. He's talking about financial economical assets are being capitalized not according to the region and their purpose, Latin America, Africa, Europe, and so on. And the question is about how, in your opinion, the problem lies here in the peculiarities of corporate management, for example, when real deeds are being hidden, or could we say here about the open discrimination of the market when different countries and corporations follow their purposes, follow their interests. So I hope my question is clear. Thank you.
If I understand the question right, it's about financialization the system. And on one level, the extreme financialization we've got and the levels of debt that we've created in places like Europe and the US is a huge barrier to change because it requires us to increase the economic activity every year, to pay off interest. Otherwise, economies begin to spiral out of control, and this is a big barrier to change. On another level, the financial system doesn't matter at all. It's just numbers on a computer. It's just some numbers on books. And we can print money, if we need to save the banks. So we can print money to build more healthy economies. And all these numbers on computers won't kill us. What we're doing with the climate will kill us. So to some extent, the financial system is a barrier to change, but it's also just a barrier to change in thinking. We have to wipe away a lot of the financial system and make it, instead of, right now we have the planet serves the economy, which serves the financial system. The financial system sits on top of all of this, and we need to find a way to move it down so that it's the other way around. The financial system serves the economy, which serves the planet. We live sustainably. So I think the financial system is very complicated, and I'm making some very broad generalizations, but it's not to me a major barrier to change. We just need to think about it more radically.
Дякую. Прошу.
Дякую.
Thank you. As far as I know about the Roman Club, it was several years ago. I didn't like your approach to limitations. Economic limitations, ecological limitations, demographic limitations. How, in general, what are the limitations that you have? Maybe there are some innovations that allow to live without limitations. So I would not like to blame the Roman Club for speaking about the golden billion or creating a global war, but in general, limitations. Is this the correct approach, to have limitations?
If you Google the Club of Rome, the first, I think, 5 items are true. And then the next 7 pages are filled with stories about how we are a secret organization that runs the world, and that we control all the world's politicians, and that we're linked to the Vatican, and we're linked to strange organizations which dominate industry. And unfortunately, that's not true. I don't run the world. So there's a great deal that's published about the Club of Rome which is not true. And it's done because we have a different view of the world and a different view of how it's going to develop, which is not to the benefit of a great many corporations and individuals. So a lot of what you read about the Club of Rome is not true. But we do think there are limits to growth, and it is a simple fact that on a finite planet, on a planet which is the only one that we know of that has any sort of intelligent life on it, anywhere in the universe, that we have something like a store cupboard of resources, and that we have a responsibility to use those resources as little as possible and for the greatest benefit for the greatest number of people. Now, when I studied economics as a student in the 1970s, we talked about scarce resources. Nobody talks about that today. We have a situation today where resources don't seem to matter, and so we plunder the planet. And we have a responsibility not just to history, but also our children, our future children, about what we do. Now, some resources are not at risk, and some are at risk. There are some resources that we have, they will last for centuries to come, but there are others that are now a problem. We have to think about that. I met a Swiss politician recently, and the Swiss live as if they had 4 planet Earths. They live far beyond the bounds of nature, and they'd done a study to see whether or not it was possible. And they came to the conclusion that we could not live on one planet. And this politician actually said so publicly: we can't live on one planet, we need more. He's dreaming. We have one planet, and we have to look after it, and we have to treat it responsibly, because that's the only way that we're going to survive as an intelligent species.
Так, будь ласка.
Good afternoon, Institute of International Relations.
The problems society faces to achieve a sustainable and desirable future are well known, but their solutions always seemed impossible. Your ideas have the power to induce policy changes that are imperative for the creation of peaceful and desirable and sustainable future. But do they have power to be provided in non-violent way, without provoking wars and without aggression upon human ancient liberties and freedoms and so on?
That's a very, very good question. I hope our ideas have the power to create the change. I mean, the Club of Rome identified these problems in 1972. Actually before, in 1968, when the Club of Rome was founded, we knew then that there was something fundamentally wrong, that if we carried on doing what we were doing, it would become unsustainable. And so we have tried for most of the last 40 years to educate politicians and educate people who advise politicians on the problems so that they would change. And if you speak to Dennis Medes or you speak to Jürgen Randers, they will tell you that for most of the last 40 years they were laughed at. They were told that they were madmen, that we could have limitless growth. I mean, there was President Reagan made a particularly famous speech against the Club of Rome, saying that, you know, that limitless growth was possible. And now, only in the last maybe 10 years, do people realize that we were right. And we were right all along. And so now we face a problem that the politicians still don't understand, and we have a more urgent need for change. And so we're coming up with ideas which we now think are suitable for the current situation, and we're trying to extend our message so that we're not just speaking to politicians and those who influence them, we're trying to speak to a much broader public, to make more people aware of the dangers that we're facing and help them encourage change. Now, come back to your issue of conflict. One of the reasons we see that is because the reasons for conflict will increase. You know, we're moving to a situation where the political system and the economic system are moving faster in the wrong direction. And you see a military-industrial complex, particularly in the United States, encouraging division. And if you add to that, you know, migration problems, water shortages, land problems in places like Bangladesh or Central Africa, you're going to see many, many more reasons for conflict. And so, again, we're trying to avoid that. We're trying to encourage a greater understanding so that we can have a peaceful revolution like you had. Something which shifts us onto a better direction without going through conflict, because unfortunately, you know, that's the huge risk right now.
Thank you. Victor Glass, Ukrainian Association, Club of Rome. Dr. Maxton, you're saying that the result of this neoliberal model, let's say it kind of new neo-colonial model, one countries get all the benefits and other countries get nothing. But in our case, and in the case of any other countries, we see that poor countries get not nothing but new debt burden. And debt burden.
Yeah.
And actually, this is the case. Yeah. So what the resolution for this problem, and how can we break this vicious circle, like this logo of Kyiv International Economic Forum? How can we really change the situation? Is there any kind of internal policy solution, or maybe should we show to our international partners some kind of geopolitical reasons in order to change the situation, because we are exporting raw materials and importing debts. And this is absolutely a model which has no future. Thank you.
I mean, this is part of the game. This is part of the great game, which is to find countries which have resources and then to encourage them to borrow. And then to bring in the IMF and the World Bank and all their economists who tell you to privatize your businesses and to sell off your national assets and to adopt the free market liberal system, and we will lend you money to help you make that happen. And so then you get into a system where you're trapped. You're trapped by debt, and you end up selling your resources for nothing, and you're unable to develop. You know, I don't just see this in Ukraine. I see this all over the world. And the countries which don't follow the system are ostracized. So you end up with Venezuela, North Korea, and Cuba, countries that refuse to accept the debt-based free market system that takes you down the same path as everybody else. How do you get out of it? You know, it's tough. You have to get rid of the debt burden, and one way to do that is again by printing money. You have to find a way of reducing the debt burden and not adopting the economic systems which you're told to adopt. You have to adopt something which is suitable for you, which is suitable for your country and your society. But I mean, the first stage, Victor, as you say, is the realization that you're in a trap, and then you can work out how to get out of it.
То що тоді виходить, що якщо одні країни можуть дозволити
So, some countries can just print money. Maybe Ukraine also. So we shouldn't be so afraid of default and just require some other debt restructuring conditions.
It's a dangerous game to go against the system, as places like Venezuela are now finding out. I mean, they push against the system, and so they become international pariahs. I think it's a question of finding friends and working with them. And I think, clearly those exist in the European Union. I don't think that it's, if I can make a more political comment, I don't think it's a good idea to befriend just one side. I think you need to find a balance, some sort of harmony with Russia as well, because they're both, you're caught between the two of them. But I think it's more of helping, encouraging support and help from countries which also understand the situation you're in, is more likely to lead to a better outcome.
Пане Макстоне, з вашого дозволу, останнє питання.
Mr. Maxton, if you allow the last question.
Your speeches, and I would like to come back to the question which I asked you at the general session. In fact, it's a bad thing you recognize that the Club of Rome does not rule the world. This is bad news for Ukraine because, in fact, your insights and your recommendations, if you would fulfill here, and if this conspiracy would really work, that will help us on our section of development. But the problem is that the Club of Rome does not rule also the European institutions. So you have very nice thinkers, you have very nice experts, and you have very nice recommendations for the countries which are developed and for the countries which are developing. Everything is fine. But Euro Commission, which distributes technical assistance, which then influence on the minds and brains of our employees of public sector, they are dumb to your recommendations. So that's a problem. And my question is how really to change it, because the bureaucratic system in any country has to have a system. For example, the Club of Rome gives those recommendations. Euro Commission does not hear it, so then technical assistance comes to Ukraine with the recommendations to open market even more. You heard that on the general session. That was expressed by the representative of European Commission and by our chief public servants.
I think you're talking about
I think
which is, in my experience, happening particularly strongly in the European Union and China. I mean, you're right, there are many people in the European Union in Brussels who don't understand where the changes are required. But there are a lot who do. I mean, there are a lot of politicians in Europe who, in Germany, in Sweden, you're one sitting beside you there, who understand the need for radical change, who understand that the economic system is not doing what everybody promises it will do, who understand that we need to change the energy, how we produce energy, who understand that we need to have a more balanced economic system. I see actually in the European Union and China the greatest hope for a more balanced economic system. But then I also hear voices from places like Venezuela or Russia who are also saying, look, this Western system isn't working. And from the Vatican and from many other places. So I see around the world an awakening. And a lot of people beginning to understand that what the Club of Rome has said for the last 40 years is basically right. So I can understand your frustration that there are certainly people in Brussels who are still pushing for neoliberal free market systems. but I see an increasing change of perspective and more people beginning to understand. And that shift in thinking can happen quite quickly, that we have a majority understanding that we need to take a different approach. So I actually feel the European Union is in a reasonably good place and we're moving in a good direction.
Дякую.
Thank you very much. Please, Mr. Yuri.
The Ukraine chairman and member of Ukrainian Association of Club of Rome. I have two little questions, maybe in Ukrainian. По-перше, яка ваша...
First of all, what is your attitude to the concept of unconditional income? Many people want to work to earn their bread in sweat. They don't want to earn money. They want just to play and don't work. In Switzerland, there was a referendum. If we had such a referendum in Ukraine, 99% will vote for non-working and just earning money. And question number 2, the Club of Rome has spent many decades pointing at the risks which some people see and some people don't see. For the next decade, what are the 3 major challenges for humanities and which are the most dangerous: environment, overpopulation, or climate change? Not to mention wars and politics. Can you give the percentage ratio? What are the most risky and what can we overcome? Thank you very much for the answer.
Перше питання про базовий.
The question number 1 about the basic guaranteed income, the Swiss position.
Basic income is certainly something that I support. It's one of the recommendations in our book for the developed world. We don't think it's possible to provide everybody with a basic income, but it's certainly possible to provide the elderly, the unemployed, and the sick with an income in the rich world of about 15,000 euros a year, which if you have a couple is 30,000, a family of 3, 45. So you end up with something which is livable. I think it's an idea whose time is coming. You see, it's not just in Switzerland, but there's a talk about it in Canada and in many other parts of Europe that we want to have a universal basic income. It's essential for a transition. If we're to make a transition from a fossil-based energy system to a renewable energy-based system, if we're to make a transition to a more healthy economic system, then we need to offer people a buffer. If they lose their jobs in one section and they have to gradually train to move into another section, they have to be able to live comfortably. And a basic income provides them with that. What we're not advocating is that people do nothing. I remember I was in Iran several years ago and I met the development minister there, the economic development minister in Iran. And he said that one of the consequences of sanctions against Iran was that they had a huge young population with nothing to do, which increased radicalism. So people need purpose and they need direction and they need some sort of quality of living, which involves work. But we've got lots of work to do. I mean, if you look all around the world, there's lots of things that we can do to make the world a better place. People who need care, societies that need to invest in themselves. We just need to think about work differently. All these mothers that bring up children, all these people that look after the elderly, which is not recognized as being economically valuable, is immensely economically valuable. So we just simply need to find a way to change the way we think about work and have a basic income, and we can transform our societies. And I've forgotten the second question.
The second question.
Oh yes, what's the biggest challenge? Climate change way above anything else. The others, the pollution of the oceans, the inequality, unemployment, none of those things will kill us. Climate change will kill us, and it is by far the most important. 90% of the problem. If we don't fix that, we're in big trouble.
Пане Макстоне, ви бачите, що
Mr. Maxton, you see that your approaches have found a response in this audience, and the questions formulated here by the representatives of young generation and elder generation, these questions show that there is all the people try to be aware and understand the stage in our life which when all people feel consequences of globalization, integration, etc. This is the chance that a nation where people would like to understand, not just hear and take as a picture, as a ready picture on TV. Such nation has a chance, not even a chance for success, but even this nation can change something in its self-positioning in this world. The thing is that today we haven't voiced this, but we had a little contest. We have an opportunity to grant to 3 of our people from the audience to give you a book. But based on your reaction, I think that 2 questions you liked the most. This is the question from Mr. Volodymyr and the question from young girl who didn't name herself. But what was the 3rd question that you liked? Please help me.
Question. I think the last question was particularly good as well. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this.
Ми вам безмежно дякуємо.
Thank you very much. We thank you a lot. Applause to you. Please, guests, come to get the books. And I would like to propose everyone to buy the book by Graeme Maxton. And there is also an opportunity to take photographs. Some people among the audience already have these books, and you can have some greetings from Mr. Maxton. And the winners, please come here.